You might well have heard of Joe Beyrle, the Screaming Eagle in the Russian army. If you have, I'm sure you don't know half the story. Joe Beyrle's family wasn't well off. He was the only one of his siblings that went through college. He's more interested in athletics than academics. But he was the type of person that Colonel Sink wanted for his 506th Regiment. Now when Joe was called up, he volunteered to be a paratrooper. Now in the interview, it was found out he was colourblind, which would normally eliminate him from being chosen. But the interviewer said, "Have you ever gone through a red light?" He said, "No." He said, "That's okay then. You'll be pushed out the plane anyway when the light goes on." So he was in. Colonel Sink wanted the men to be ready for action at any time. You might remember this scene from the Band of Brothers when they were fed a sumptuous meal of spaghetti and then a delicious dessert. And then suddenly they were asked to run up Currahee. On a furlough home from Toccoa, he was treated as a hero, even though all he'd done till then was a bit of training. One lady asked him how many flights he'd taken. He said 11 takeoffs and no landings. Joe became known as Jumping Joe at Toccoa. Their men had to do a certain number of jumps, and often they weren't too happy about that. They were worried about breaking legs or ankles. So Joe would do their jump for them. They made the crossing from the US to England in the HMS Samaria. It took over a week. Then from Liverpool they took the train and ended up at Ramsbury in Wiltshire, where they were billeted. His reputation led to him being chosen for a special mission. The resistance, as well as needing arms and medical supplies and clothing, they needed money to bribe Germans, railway workers and officials. And the best international currency was gold. So this would be taken in by somebody parachuting in and get the money to the resistance. And then later they'd be taken out by a plane landing to pick him up. The mission was secret, so he was given permission to go and see his brother Bill, who was apparently ill. He was taken to Hungerford Station. Then by train he went to Middle Wallop and from there to the airfield. There were 3 men going. They were taken separately into an office. And the officer gave Joe a bandolier of gold. And he said, "This is worth more than you and I will earn in our lifetimes, so don't lose it." Then the 3 of them got in the Lysander and it took off. Now they were going to jump separately. The pilot alternately skimmed the waves and went up into the clouds. But finally, over France, he came down to 1,000 feet and he was looking for the lights marking the landing spot. They were there, so he gave the indication to Joe to jump. He had a heavy landing. As he was taking off his harness, he then got out his pistol as there was a group of people walking across the field. He said, "It's a breezy night," and the answer came back, "Let's go sailing," and that was the correct answer, so everything was okay. There were 5 men and a woman. The woman was there with her lover in case they needed to cause a distraction if any Germans came along. So they went off some way into a barn. The leader counted the gold and it was the agreed amount that was coming in. So he got out a bottle of wine from under the hay and they had a drink. Now the resistance would get him out of Normandy, but it was going to take some time. So he's moved frequently until the day came for him to get out. Joe didn't know exactly where he was, except that he was near Alençon. He'd seen that on a map before he left. Now after a week of being moved around, they were taken to a field and the Lysander came in. No lights were on the ground, so the pilot must have been there before. And when the Lysander landed, a horse cart came in with a big barrel on it, a cider barrel, and they started filling up the plane. They probably bought that fuel with the gold that Joe had brought in. When it was time to go, he ran across to the Lysander. An American came from the other side of the field, so there were 2 passengers They started asking each other questions and then lapsed into the no questions phase, which was the best thing to do. When they got back to Middle Wallop, they were debriefed and he was told, you don't tell anybody where you've been or who you've met. A few weeks later, he was taken into Lieutenant Colonel Wolverton's office again, and Wolverton said, your brother Bill has been taking a turn for the worse. Do you want to go and see him again? And so he was off on another mission. At this time, the other two were 101st men. They were excited about being the first to jump into Normandy. Joe didn't say anything. At this time, Joe was the last to jump, and instead of landing in the field, he landed in trees. So he crossed his legs to avoid getting astride a branch. And when he pulled his parachute out the tree, that caused a big shower of leaves. This time during his stay, he showed the resistance how to use explosives to the best effect. A German patrol noticed that there was a tree damaged, and they found a piece of a jumpsuit that had been ripped off when he came through the trees. So they knew somebody had parachuted in. Now there were arrests and the interrogations, and it became difficult for him to move around. Some safe houses refused to take him, so he had to stay in the same place longer. One day he's being moved in a hay cart, he was under the hay, and they were stopped by a German. He heard the voices and seemed to be getting quite excited. He was waiting for the word meld from the driver, which would mean come out firing. But then the whip cracked and the cart carried on. When they got to a safe barn, the driver explained that he'd bribed the guard with a gold coin that Joe had brought in. Now one evening he was being moved with a group of resistance. Then suddenly they stopped, fanned out around a field, and then the Lysander came in. This time he was the only passenger. He wondered what happened to the other two. Had they been taken out earlier, or had they been caught in the dragnet? He never knew. Preparations for the invasion were hotting up. Joe knew that the next time he went into Normandy, it would be with 6,000 Screaming Eagles. The D-Day had been set for the 5th of June and then put back 24 hours to the 6th. So on the night of the 5th, they emplaned and they took off. Now the Armada skirted round the Channel Islands to avoid the flak there, but as they approached the coast, they came under flak fire. The pilot was trying to avoid this, and there was explosions near them. The plane was rocking, they were all thrown together. During the crossing, some men had decided to lighten their load by getting rid of their gas mask and their spare chute. The height they were dropping from, there was no time to use a reserve chute. Now the flak stopped when they went into a cloud bank, because the flak couldn't see them. But when they came out the clouds, the serial was dispersed, and then the flak started again. A burst of machine gun fire ripped through the floor. Apparently nobody was hurt. And very soon, McKnight called to hook up. So they all stood up. And then one of the troopers said, "My boot's full of blood." He'd been hit. He hadn't noticed it before. So he was unhooked from the line and he slumped against the fuselage. McKnight went out first and the plane was cleared in less than 10 seconds. Now as Joe was going down, he could see he was approaching a spire, and he realised this must be Saint-Côme-du-Mont, which is just over a mile from their drop zone and 3 miles from their objective, the bridges at Brevand. Joe let go of his leg bag and it hit the roof like a wrecking ball. 2 seconds later he hit the roof and slid down to the eaves, just stopping himself falling off by his fingernails. Then he clambered down the buttress on the side of the church. There were 2 snipers up the church, and he thought of going in to shoot them, but he had I Company's radio, so he thought he should get on and get towards Brevand. So he crawled through the graves to the wall, and he had to vault over the wall. Nobody shot at him. He knew how to get out of town, and go eastwards. The hedgerows were impenetrable, so the only way to move was along lanes. If he heard machine gun fire from Germans, he'd go the other way. Every half hour he would check his radio frequencies. He went through all of them to hear if there's any messages. Nothing. So he carried on. And then after some time he realised he'd turned back to Saint-Côme-du-Mont again. So he listened to the radio frequencies one more time, and then he smashed the radio and buried it, because it would have been a valuable prize for the Germans if they'd got it. Now Joe was the radio man and the demolition man for the I Company. He thought, if I can't get to the bridges in time, I could do something useful here. He knew there was a transformer in town. That was thanks to the resistance. So he cased the town and he found the transformer just as described. They watched it for some time. He also saw there was a group of German vehicles not far. And so he approached them and he burst all the tyres. They watched the transformer for a bit and he saw the gateway was open. So he went in. He put explosives on each side of the transformer, because they had to be on it, not near it, to be effective. And he set a 40-second fuse and walked away. There was a low boom. Not much else happened, but he thought at least some German radios are going to go off air. So German soldiers came up the main road and they stopped. So he pulled out 2 grenades, pulled the pins out. He lobbed one up in the air towards the Germans and he rolled the other one down the road towards them, and then got out of the way as quick as possible. During D-Day, he moved this way and that, looking at his compass often. He hadn't slept since the 4th. The adrenaline kept him going, but now he was drained. Things started to get blurry. He took his helmet off, so not to affect the compass, and then he couldn't find his helmet again. He would stick his head through a hedge to see what was there, then move on. And then he stuck his head through a hedge again. Then he heard, "Hand hoch!" He stumbled into a machine gun nest manned by 15 German paratroopers. And they took him to a compound just north of Saint-Côme-du-Mont by a farm. There were many 101st men in the compound being closely guarded, but the wounded men were less closely guarded. So Joe faked a bad back and got himself with the wounded men. He found Major Kent was there, treating the men. He'd let himself be taken prisoner to stay with the wounded. The Germans respected him. They called him Herr Major Doctor. Joe was allowed to go into the courtyard to relieve himself. From there he could see the body of Lieutenant Colonel Wolverton hanging in an apple tree. He'd never reached the ground. The walking prisoners were now moved again to the south of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, to a place now called Dead Man's Corner, which was the HQ of the 6th German Parachute Regiment. They were taken one by one into an underground bunker and interrogated. All Joe said was his name and his serial number. And they knew he was from the 101st, but he wouldn't confirm it. As night fell on the 7th, the walking POWs were moved out again along the causeway towards Carentan. They exchanged news. They heard that the causeways coming off Utah Beach had been captured by the 101st, and that the bridges of Brevens were held. Now, that wasn't true, because the bridges, as they weren't held, they'd been bombed on the 7th by the American Air Force. Now, with Captain Harwick and Ticker from my company, Joe worked up a plan to escape. So they picked up some pieces of asphalt from the road, and they were going to throw them into the marshes to make a diversion and then go the other way. But just then a shell came in from a ship and fell right among the column. Some naval observer must have taken the column for German troops. But this gave them a chance to get away. They went into the marshes and waited till the Germans recouped the survivors and started moving on. And then they started moving away. They stopped to drink in a stream as a machine gun fire opened up. Harwick and Ticker went one way and Joe went the other way. So Joe was on his own again. He was alone again, and the piece of shrapnel he got in his butt was starting to make itself felt. Now he went westwards, he crossed the causeway. He was worried about going too far because the high land that way he thought would be held by the Germans. So he went this way and that. He could hear sounds of battle coming from the direction of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, and then he heard tanks. So he thought, well, Saint-Côme-du-Mont must be taken. So he started moving across the causeway again. He went into the reeds, and then he heard "Hand hock" again, and he was a prisoner again. Now he's back near Saint-Côme-du-Mont. Now this time the interrogator took his dog tags. Now Joe still had his uniform, but the German with an American uniform tried to infiltrate the American lines, and he was shot, no doubt, by a German. And he had Joe's dog tags on, and so Joe Beyrle was considered killed in action. The POWs were loaded into a truck with POW on the roof. They started off towards Saint-Lô. It took 12 hours to get near Saint-Lô. And then the guard shouted out, "Yabo!" That was their word for the fighter bombers, Typhoons and Thunderbolts. The three of them came along and strafed the convoy. And they could see the POW, but they also knew that the Germans would move their troops in trucks with POW on the top. It was a difficult dilemma. The guards and the valid prisoners spread out into the roadside, but the wounded POWs couldn't move. Afterwards, the guards made the POWs put the bodies into the ditch so the French could see them, and had to carry on foot. They went through Saint-Lô, which had already been bombed. It was a pile of ruins, and they carried on towards a place called La Chapelle-sur-Vire. They were herded into an ex-monastery that became known as Starvation Hill because they had so little to eat. The Germans gave them a soup that they called whisper soup. Now these buildings were marked with POW on the roof, and the pilots knew that this was a prison compound. If they were in the area attacking a target, on the way out they'd come over the prison camp and waggling their wings. Now one prisoner decided to escape, and during the changing of the guard he climbed up onto the wall, and then he laid in the ivy on the wall for hours. Now when the nightfall came, the next change to the guard, somebody threw him up a rope made of sheets to allow him to get down the other side out of the camp. After this, Joe was worried he was losing his initiative. He decided to escape. He tried to get sheets to make a rope, but sheets was so valuable nobody wanted to give them up. They heard that Rommel had been attacked on the 17th of July, and then they heard the sound of bombing in Operation Cobra just after Saint-Lô had been taken, and they saw the bombers before they turned to go back to England. And some of the men thought if they escaped, they could hide out and wait till Patton's troops found them. But as it was, they were moved a week before the Americans got to where they were. Joe was taken to a chateau he guessed was near Falaise. He had harsh interrogations over a few days, and it ended with him being smashed in the back of the head with a rifle butt and falling off the stool they were perched on onto his head. He came out of the coma in the infirmary. His clothes had been washed. Now the Allies are approaching, and so the POWs were advanced, Chartres, Paris, and then onto a train. Now the train journey took over a week, and the train was strafed on the way. Many men were casualties. When it finally arrived, it was into Stalag XII A. The prisoners were deloused and then given a shower. Their clothes were taken away and then returned to them, laundered, and very efficiently each man got his right uniform back. They slept for 12 hours before being given an identity card and their photo being taken. Then they're allowed to write a postcard to their families. Joe's family received a postcard from him just 3 days after his funeral service. They then had to give back the Purple Heart he'd got posthumously and the money they'd received for him being killed, because they were very happy to do that. But he was still in the records as being killed in action. They were continuously hungry. The Red Cross sent a parcel for each man every week, but for some reason there was one parcel for 4 men. Some men took a masochistic pleasure in recounting meals they'd had. Now, the treatment of the POWs would change with the flux of the war. When the Allies were advancing, the German guards were more lenient, and if the Germans pushed back the Allies a bit, they would get stricter. Joe was recovering from his fractured skull and was thinking about escaping, but before he could, they were moved again to Stalag XIV A. But before escaping, he had to build up his form. A British doctor took the piece of shrapnel out of his butt and he kept it with him until after the war. The British used to play tricks on the Germans now and again. A German guard saw a piece of wire sticking out the ground. He pulled on it and it led all round the camp and towards a British hut. And at the end they pulled on it and it was connected to some rusty old cans under the latrines. Now, before he could get into the escape committee, Joe was transferred again. As he was getting into a boxcar, the guard saw his jump boots and asked what unit he was in. When he said 101st, the guard said, "Oh, they've jumped again into Holland," because that was Market Garden. Now, in that train journey, Joe had made a compass. He realised they were going eastwards. The journey took a few days. He tried to scrape the support of a grill out the side of the boxcar to try and get out. He had a little blade they made from scrap of metal. After 2 days, the blade broke, and so he gave up. They got to 3C, which was in Poland. Master Sergeant Coleman was the commander of the compound, and he was head of the escape committee. He heard that Joe tried to escape from the boxcar, and so he was admitted into the escape committee. Now, plans that involved tunnelling or mass riots to break out were abandoned, and as nobody had a good idea, the committee became dormant. Joe was still determined to escape, and he found 2 men who would be good accomplices, Quinn and Brewer. Now, in the camps, your wealth was measured by cigarettes. They were sent regularly by the Red Cross, and as Joe didn't smoke, he became quite wealthy. Now, after a craps game win, he had 70 packs, so they had a lot of cigarettes to use to bribe German guards and people once they got out of the camp. Now, the plan was to bribe a guard to allow them to cut the wire and get out, and there was a train that passed nearby every night, and they get onto it and go east towards where the Russians were. Now, one of the head guards was named Schultz, and they managed to bribe him. He agreed to allow them to cut the wire if they escaped in the next shift, not his shift. And so they gave him 10 packs of Lucky Strikes, and the escape committee were going to give him the extra 10 if they got out safely. Now, they'd had a pair of wire cutters they made from 2 blades bolted together. And so on the night, the guard was on duty, and they took it in turns to cut the wire. It was very slow going with just these handmade wire cutters. And finally, they were cut. They fitted them back together again with wax and then waited till the guard changed. And after the guard changed, the Schultz, he kept the new guard talking a bit, and so they could get out. They got out, they put the wires back together again with wax, and then went to a nearby wood. And they had 4 hours to wait before the train come, and they started discussing what would they do if the train didn't come, but it did. It was going very slowly, and so they could easily get on it. There were flatbeds with Mark IVs on, and they chose a boxcar. When they got in it, they found it was full of grain, so at least they had something to eat. Now, the train was going north-east. It went on for some hours, and then it stopped in a station. Wagons were shunted around, and then the train started moving again. And now they were going southwest. And they heard they were going across a big bridge, across a river. And Joe said, "Oh, we're heading back into Germany now." And they ended up in Berlin. That was the last place they wanted to be. Now, they thought their only hope was to find some German resistance, and they weren't very common, so how were they going to do that? The shunting yard they were in was 3 miles by 5 miles wide. They roamed around for a few days. Then they saw a man checking the axles on the wagons. After some debate, Joe, who could speak German, he decided to go and talk to him. So he said, "Kamerad," and he told him their story about being escaped Americans. He didn't want to know, and he walked away. The next day, they saw him again, and so Joe went to speak to him again. And this time he offered him some packs of Lucky Strikes. They said, "We need food." And so finally the German said, "Well, I'll see what I can do," and he went off. Cut the long story short, they ended up in the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. Now, they were separated, and they had pretty brutal interrogations. The Gestapo wanted them to admit to being spies and saboteurs. And after a few days of this, a Wehrmacht officer came in with another soldier with his weapon across his chest, and they started arguing about who had the right to the prisoners. The Gestapo said, "These men have admitted to being paratroopers. They've dropped in, they're saboteurs." The Wehrmacht said, "No, they're escaped prisoners and they're my responsibility." Now, this argument went on for some time. Unfortunately, the Wehrmacht won and he took them out. Now, he didn't know where they'd escaped from, so he asked them, and they said Stalag XIII A, and so he took them back. Now, they were put straight into solitary confinement. Unfortunately, that was cut short by an Alpine visit of the Red Cross. So they were put in separate huts. Now, they were treated like lepers because since their escape, the camp had been in lockdown. Now, one day, Schultz, the guard they'd bribed, he took Joe to one side. He said, "Be a good boy now, Joe. The war will be finished soon." There was now a crystal radio set in the camp, tuned to the BBC. They learned that the Allies had got to the Siegfried Line and that the Russians were advancing rapidly. Now, with the Battle of the Bulge going well for the Germans guards became more cocky. Joe was still determined to escape, and he managed to contact Quinn and Brewer and found they were ready to escape as well. But they needed help from other prisoners to put their plan into action. The escape committee was out of question. Now, their plan depended on three things. Now, since the visit of the Red Cross, there was a stretcher by the gateway that went into the German compound. Every day there was a cart came into the camp with 3 barrels full of vegetables, and when the cart left, the barrels were empty. They needed somebody to make a diversion, and they managed to convince one of the prisoners to do this. So Brewer was jogging around the perimeter, as he often did. Then suddenly he collapsed. Quinn and Joe got the stretcher, put Brewer on it, and headed for the gateway. The Germans opened it to allow them to get to the infirmary. And just then the fight broke out, and all the guards were watching this fight, and they found the cart. They wondered if it's going to come every day, but they got into the barrels, which were now empty. The driver was watching the fight. Then he got back in the cart, and the cart started off. Now, it might well be that the driver was worried that the machine guns in the towers might open up on the riot. He was going pretty fast, and on the first bend, the 3 barrels fell off the wagon. They all started running. Now, Joe was in the middle, and Brewer and Quinn were both hit. As they decided, Joe kept running. He could hear the dogs behind him, but he managed to get to a stream and he waded down it, and then he found another stream to wade along. Now he kept going, and in a week he'd gone about 30 miles, and he could hear the thunder of artillery. He knew the Russians weren't far away. Now he'd been living off grain that he got in barns where he slept, but he needed more food. He decided he'd get food even if he had to steal it. Now from a barn he watched a farmhouse for some time. He saw there was a farmer and his wife lived there. And one evening he knocked on the door, and there he said, "Comrade," and he told him his story about being an American POW. The wife inside, she called out, "Are the Americans here already?" But they didn't want to help him, and the farmer closed the door. Now Joe had thought of barging in, but he thought the farmer might well be armed, and so he thought, "I'll go back to the barn." Then in the morning, he heard shells falling in the farmyard and around, and Germans were firing back. He wasn't sure where from. And then the Germans pulled out, and then the farmyard was full of Russian soldiers. They went into the farmhouse, liberated a pig, brought the farmer and his wife out, and shot them. And some of the Russian soldiers were wounded, and Joe thought, this isn't a good time to show yourself, so he just kept in the barn. Now during that night, he was woken by the sound of tanks, and he could hear they were Sherman tanks. In the morning, he looked out the barn, and there were some Russian soldiers sat around a fire eating. So with his lucky strikes in one hand, holding his hands above his head, he walked out the barn, and he shouted in Russian. He picked up, he said, "American comrade." The Russians looked at him. They allowed him to come nearer, and then the officers said to frisk him. They looked at his eagle buttons and his uniform and decided he really was an American. He indicated that he was hungry, and so they gave him something to eat, and he rolled up in a corner and went to sleep. Now he didn't sleep for long. Two officers came to see him, the commissar and the commander of the tank unit. Now he didn't realise at the beginning, with all the winter clothing on, the tank commander was a woman. She was in fact Alexandra Samusenko, the only woman tank commander in the Russian army. And the commissar could speak English, so he asked lots of questions, and Joe was happy to tell him everything he wanted to know, and then he went to sleep again. And the next morning, the commander came with the interpreter, and she said that Joe would have to be passed up the echelons to be processed. And she gave him a hug. She said, "Goodbye, comrade." He said, "I don't want to go anywhere. I want to fight the Germans with you." And she was surprised, but then she broke out the vodka and they had a drink on it. Now the men wondered what position Joe should have in the tanks. It was finally decided he should be a scout because he knew the area quite well, having walked through it for over a week. And so he was to ride on the hull of the tank. The Russians also wondered what they should call him. But Joe said, "Well, call me Joe, like Stalin." And so he was called Yo. Now the Russians had paid a heavy tribute to advance, about 1,000 men per mile. And so a lot of the tank crew were actually women. Now their system of attack was for the pathfinders to attack the Germans. Now these were the men he'd seen come into the farm first, who'd shot the farmer and his wife. So they would attack the Germans. And if they couldn't push them back, the tank units had Mongol tank fodder they'd send in to attack the Germans. Now they didn't carry radios with them. The tank commander had to judge how things were going and where and when to attack with the tanks. And they were usually successful. Now Joe found he couldn't get into fights with the Germans. There was always a Russian in front of him. They were protecting him. He resented this, but he couldn't complain. But he became useful in repairing their radios, so he became the radio repairman. Now one day the Germans had left a trunk across the road to slow them down, and the Russians were hacking at it with axes, and Joe saw there was a mine not far away, and so he used the explosives in the mine and he blew the trunk up and he saved them an hour. So now he was the radio and demolition expert. Now as they approached the Oder, getting nearer to Berlin, Joe was happy about that, but the Russians became gloomy. They said rivers take a lot of casualties. They met the reconnaissance unit coming back from the river. The commander said all their amphibious craft had been blown out the water by 88s. So the tank commander, Major, she was told to go north to Kustrin, where there was a bridge, and that was not far from Stalag XIII A, where Joe had escaped from. Now for once they were actually taking on German armoured vehicles. Once they dispatched them, Joe was surprised to see the German soldiers running away. And he realised they weren't armed, and he realised they were POWs. So he ran in front of the tanks to stop them firing. He said to the Major, he said, if we follow this track, it'll lead us to the Stalag XIII A. So the tanks smashed down the barbed wire and fired on the towers, even though the Germans were trying to surrender. Joe ran to find the Americans. They were surprised to find him there, alive, and even more surprised to find him with the Russians. He said, where are Quinn and Brewer? And he was shown 2 crosses. Then somebody came to find him. They said, the Major wants you. She wanted him to blow up the strong room. So he got some explosives she gave him, laid them on the doors. He told everybody to go out. There was a boom and the door was hanging off its hinges. Now he went straight in. He wanted to find his records, and he found them, and he found his mugshot. Then the Russians had come in. They were more interested in the watches and other valuables taken off prisoners. And he didn't have time to say goodbye to the Americans before they were on their way again. And the Major, she had over $200,000 worth of currency in a bag. In the tank, she'd thrown out some shells to make room for it. As they approached the Oder, they lost several tanks every day, more and more casualties. And then suddenly there was a screaming of Stukas. Joe actually saw the bomb arriving. He woke up, he was in the ditch with the medic and the Major leaning over him. And when the medic pulled his coat away from his groin, the Major turned her head away. And that shocked Joe, because he thought she must have seen some pretty gruesome things before. And she leaned over him, she said, it's time to go home now, Joe, back to your family. Goodbye, comrade. And she was trotting off to her tank. Now, he was on a stretcher. The troops going on were giving him a V sign and shouted Berlin, as if they were going to meet up there. They knew he would never get there. After some delay, he was taken to hospital. He was well treated, fed, but he still had the shrapnel in his groin and his knee. And then a woman doctor came round and she took out the shrapnel from his groin and his knee with no anaesthetic. And then the doctors came round, making sure everybody's dressings were clean and everybody was okay. It was quite a commotion. And then it was Marshal Zhukov was coming. He entered the ward, the far end from where Joe was. All the soldiers were praising him. He was a great hero to everybody. When he got to Joe's bed, somebody told him, this is an American paratrooper. And he said, I heard that the paratroopers were widely dispersed when they dropped. Did you land in Poland? Everybody laughed, as they'd never laughed for a long time. Of course, Joe didn't understand what he said. Now, when they went out, the translator came back and he said, can General Zhukov do anything for you? And Joe said, well, if he could write down on a piece of paper that I'm an American POW, that would be a great help. And the next day he brought back a letter on embossed notepaper and it said it enjoined anybody who read it to help Joe get through the Soviet territory. There were a lot more wounded coming in, and Joe couldn't stand the moaning of all the men, so he decided to go AWOL. He put all his clothes as if he was going to the latrines, which of course were outside, and just walked out. Now his passport from Zhukov got him onto the train to Warsaw and then a convoy. He's sure he was going to find the American embassy at Warsaw. He didn't realise it was just a pile of ruins. Now near the cathedral, where there was the only place he could find anybody, he asked some Russian soldiers where the embassy was, and they took him to a convent, and he was treated there by the nuns, who were of course nurses. Then from there he got a hospital train to Moscow. And that took over a week. Now in Moscow he approached some Russian soldiers, showed him his passport, and one of them who could speak English took him in his car and he drove him to the subway station. They went 2 or 3 stops. He was telling him how great the subway system was, and then they had to walk about half a mile to the American embassy. Now they could have gone in the car, but the Russian wanted to show off the subway system. Now when they got to the embassy, there were 2 Marines guarding the gate. The Russian gave the Zhukov passport to them and then left, taking the passport with him. So he was interviewed in the embassy and given a meal, and then he went to sleep in a bedroom. And the next day the secretary came in. He said, "There's a problem." He said, "You've been reported as killed in action and we've been told to treat you as a suspect. So you've got to leave the embassy because only bona fide Americans can stay here. You'll have to go to the Hotel Ambassador." So Joe was in a hotel room with 2 Marines guarding him. And now he had the dumbest idea he'd had for a long time. He said, "I'm going to escape and I'm going to join the Red Army and get to Berlin." And so he went outside the bedroom. He grabbed the Marine, and he intended to put the Marine in the bedroom. Of course, he ended up with Joe on his back and then being locked in the bedroom. But then the next day the secretary came back with the good news. He said, "We've checked your fingerprints and they match up, and the Red Cross has confirmed that you were in the Stalag XIII A." So now he could be on his way home. Now the Marines were dismissed and they had no hard feelings. They gave him a hug before they left him. So now he was on his way back. They got to Odessa and then to Port Said. And then by a strange coincidence, the ship taking him to Naples was the HMS Samaria, the same ship that took him from the US to England in 1943. Now he got back home in May 45, the same month that the war finished in Europe. Now the town of Muskegon had put up a flagpole with a plaque at the bottom with the names of the men killed. And Joe Beyrle's name was the first on the list. And so he had an unofficial ceremony with some other veterans, and he removed his name from that list. Now I've told you the whole story from start to finish, but there's lots more details, and you can find them in the book I got this information from in the description. See you soon. Don't forget to give a thumbs up, subscribe, give comments, and even help the channel through Patreon or PayPal me.